Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we return to the desert, where wind and memory meet, where lanterns glow softly, and the cross upon the hill waits beneath the stars. Let the words drift around you like evening air, carrying you toward quiet places beyond the day. You remember how the wind softened as the sun began to sink, the air turning from its daytime heat into something cooler, quieter, like a long-held breath finally released across the empty miles of sand that seemed to stretch without end. The desert never truly felt silent to you, for even in its stillness, there was always the soft scrape of shifting grains underfoot, the faint hum of heat fading from the stone, the occasional cry of a bird circling far above. Yet on that evening the quiet felt heavier somehow, like a pause before words too important to speak. You had come the long way, as you always did, following the path that wound past the thorn trees whose roots clung stubbornly to dry earth, your steps leaving narrow prints in the pale dust, while the last streaks of light clung stubbornly to the horizon as though reluctant to let go. The cross stood alone on its rise of stone, weathered and splintered, its wood cracked by years of sun and wind, a place where the old stories said travelers once rested, a marker for the lost and weary when nights swallowed the desert in its cold, black mouth. You had seen it often in daylight, casting its thin shadow like a sundial across the earth. Nothing more than timber nailed into shape, yet always there was something in the way it leaned slightly eastward, as though listening for voices no one else could hear. That evening the air tasted faintly of iron, the way it does before rain that rarely comes, though the sky showed no promise of clouds, only that endless copper glow fading slowly into deep blue where the first stars waited with patient stillness. You paused at the foot of the rise, feeling the cooling stones through the thin soles of your sandals, the warmth stored through the day bleeding gently into the night, the smell of dust and distant sagebrush drifting with the wind that carried a softness you could almost mistake for breath. The cross had never looked different before, yet, as you watched from below, the first glimmer began along its center beam, so faint you wondered if it was only the reflection of the last light of day, a trick of sun and shadow playing at the edges of your eyes. You climbed slowly, not because the way was steep, but because the air itself seemed to thicken around you. The smell of dry grass rising with each step, the silence deepening until even the wind seemed to hush its own restless song. At the top, you stopped where the ground leveled out, and there it was, the cross standing taller than it seemed from below, its grain rough under your hand when you reached out to touch it, the wood warm still, though the day's heat was fading. The glow was real now, faint but certain, running along the wood as though fire moved beneath its surface without smoke or heat, just that steady, living shimmer that turned its edges silver against the darkening sky. You thought of lanterns you had seen in the village on festival nights, the way paper shades breathed light through their thin walls. But this was not like that at all, for no flame wavered here, no source revealed itself, only the quiet radiance, as though the wood itself remembered the sun and refused to release it. The air cooled further as night came slowly, the first stars gathering above, while the wind shifted to bring the smell of distant cedar fires from homes far beyond the dunes, smoke and sand and memory mingling in the dark. You stood alone beside the cross, the ground rough beneath your feet, the first insects beginning their hidden chorus in the scrub below. the whole desert folding itself into evening while this strange light clung to the timber-like breath on glass. The longer you watched, the brighter it seemed, though never enough to banish the shadows. Only enough to mark its shape so no one could mistake it even from far off, a pale beacon with no reason to be. You ran your hand along its upright beam, felt the splinters catch softly at your skin, yet no warmth came from the glow itself, no sound, no tremor, only that unwavering light, as if the cross had chosen this night, this hour, for something you were not meant to name. Behind you the desert spread endlessly, silvered now under a rising moon that blurred the edges of dunes into soft hills. The air cold enough to raise small bumps along your arms, though you kept your hand against the wood as though it might speak if only you were patient. You thought of the old travelers' tales told by firelight when wind rattled the doors, stories of wandering prophets and lost kings, of signs appearing where no feet had walked in years, of voices carried in storms that left no footprints behind. The glow gave no answer to such thoughts, only burned on gently, casting no shadow, making no sound, neither growing nor fading, as though bound to some rhythm deeper than the turning of day and night. When at last you sat on the stone beside it, the ground still holding a whisper of warmth, the wind wrapped around you like a shawl woven from the breath of the hills, carrying the dry sweetness of juniper and dust, the faint taste of salt from unseen lakes far to the west. Time thinned as you watched, the moon climbing higher, the stars thickening overhead like spilled grains, until you no longer knew how long you had been there, or whether anyone else in the wide desert saw what you saw. The cross stood above you, lit from within by that impossible light, while the world around it surrendered slowly to night, the horizon disappearing, the shapes of rocks and distant cliffs melting into the same dark fabric, until only sky and sand and the glowing wood remained. You felt then not fear, but the same quiet weight as when you stand before an ocean or a mountain, that sense of something older and larger than any name, something that asks nothing but to be witnessed. So you sat until the wind grew colder, and the sense of dust and dry sage sharpened under the moon, until the glow neither dimmed nor spread, until the desert itself seemed to sleep beneath the silver light. When you rose at last and made your way back down the stony path, your steps careful on the loose gravel, the cross still shone behind you, small now against the vast sky, its light steady as the stars, though no fire warmed its wood. And you knew even then, though you could not say why, that when you returned in the morning it would be nothing but weathered timber again, leaning eastward in the wind, waiting for night to come once more. You remember the morning after the glow, how the desert carried that pale, hushed stillness that always follows the long wait of night, the air cool enough to taste of stone and shadow, before the sun returned to claim everything in gold. The village had stirred early, as it often did when winds shifted in the dark hours, for the people of the desert always felt such things in their sleep, the faint rattling of shutters, the restless turning of dogs outside the doors, the whisper of sand moving where sand should not move. You had risen before the bells called the day awake, stepping outside into the faint light that came thin and silver along the horizon. The earth beneath your feet, cool and powder soft, smelling faintly of dust that remembered water from long ago. Your eyes had followed the familiar line of hills beyond the well, beyond the tangle of thorn trees, to where the cross waited on its lonely rise, its shape no different now from any other morning, nothing to suggest the strange glow it had held through the night. The sky was that deep, gray blue before sunrise when even the birds seemed uncertain whether to begin their songs, and the air carried that brief, delicate coolness you always wished would last but knew would vanish as soon as the sun lifted its edge above the dunes. It was then, with the village still half asleep and smoke just beginning to rise from the cook fires, that you saw the first set of footprints winding away from the well, cutting across the dry ground toward the distant cross. They were narrow, uneven prints, pressed deep as though by feet not used to the long distances of the desert, and they glimmered faintly with dew gathered in the hollows, each one a small pool of silver under the coming light. You followed them without hurry, carrying only the soft weight of curiosity, the way one follows a drifting cloud or a line of birds across the sky, not expecting answers, only the quiet company of motion through stillness. The ground carried that faint scent of cooling earth, the sweetness of sage carried thinly on the breeze, the promise of heat waiting patiently behind the hills, though for now the world remained wrapped in its gray shawl of dawn. The footprints led you past the thorn trees, whose shadows still clung thick to the sand, past the dry stream that sometimes ran with water in years of good rain, past the flat stones where lizards often sunned themselves, though none had yet stirred from their cracks. Each print seemed spaced by a stride that slowed as it neared the rise, as though the walker had grown weary or uncertain, the edges crumbling slightly where wind had begun to touch them, though not yet enough to erase their shape. You thought then of the glow the night before, of the way it had wrapped the cross in its pale, silent fire, and you wondered who else might have seen it from far off, who might have risen in the dark and come seeking its meaning. The air warmed as you walked, the first thin cries of birds weaving through the thorn trees, the smell of smoke from breakfast fires drifting after you, carrying the faint sweetness of dates and millet cakes cooking on flat stones. When at last you reached the foot of the rise, the footprints thickened, circling as though the walker had paced back and forth before climbing. The sand scuffed where heels had dug in, the story of hesitation written plainly in the dust. You climbed slowly, feeling the first sunlight beginning to brush the tops of the dunes behind you, its warmth faint but certain, like breath slowly returning after a long pause, the air carrying that golden clarity only early morning ever holds. At the top, the footprints spread wide across the stone, as though the traveler had stood for a long time before the cross. The deep marks where they had turned in small circles, then moved again, then stopped once more near the base where the ground still held a trace of night's coolness, and then, beyond the cross, nothing. No trail leading down the far side, no prints wandering off into the open desert, no faint impressions softening toward the horizon, only clean, untouched sand stretching in every direction as though no feet had ever crossed it at all. You knelt beside the last mark, tracing its edges with your hand, feeling the powdery crumble of its walls, the thin crust of dew breaking under your touch, the shape already blurring as the first breeze lifted grains into the air. The cross stood silent above you, no longer glowing, only its weathered timber dark against the brightening sky, the cracks in its wood catching the new sun like thin veins of shadow, its leaning shape watching the horizon as it always had. You thought then of old tales told by firelight, of travelers who walked through dreams and left signs behind, of saints who crossed deserts with no food or water, their footprints lasting only until dawn before vanishing into the wind. The air grew warmer as you stood, the first true heat of day sliding over your skin like water poured slowly from a bowl, carrying with it the smell of stone growing dry again after the night's brief breath of coolness. You followed the rim of the rise in widening circles, scanning the sand for any hint of passage, but the ground lay smooth in every direction. Only the wind's small fingers writing faint lines that led nowhere, erased almost as soon as they formed. From the village below came the faint clang of a bell calling workers to the fields, the bleating of goats released from their pens, the high voices of children already chasing each other through the dust, their laughter scattering like birds startled into flight. But up on the rise there was only the hush of wind through dry grass, the faint creak of the crosses, wood as it leaned ever so slightly eastward, the empty space beyond where no prince led away, as though whoever had come had simply dissolved into air. You sat for a long while on the warm stone, the sun climbing steadily behind you, the world brightening in slow layers of gold and shadow, the cross cutting its thin line upward like a sundial, marking a time no clock would name. The footprints began to fade as you watched, edges softening under the sun's weight, the breeze carrying thin streamers of dust across them until they became only shallow depressions. Then unevenness, then nothing at all but smooth sand once more. By the time you rose to return, the day had grown sharp with heat, the sky washed clear and empty, the ground blinding where sunlight struck it full, the cross already shrinking behind you as you followed your own trail back toward the village. You glanced over your shoulder more than once, half expecting to see some lone figure appear at the rise, someone who might claim the vanished prince, but there was only the cross, standing silent against the sky, alone as it had always been. And in that brightening emptiness you felt again that same stillness as the night before, as though the desert itself held its breath around this small, strange place, waiting for someone to notice what it would not explain. You remember the first time someone told you about the traveler, the story coming in soft pieces while the evening wind folded itself through the open shutters, carrying the cool breath of night across the tiled floor where shadows gathered like water. It was said he arrived without warning, appearing on the edge of the village road at the hour when daylight and darkness pass each other like strangers who share no words. His figure bent slightly beneath the long weight of the journey behind him. No one saw from which direction he came, for the desert keeps its secrets well, giving back neither footprints nor dust trails after the wind has done its quiet work, so the people only knew that suddenly he was there. You were told he carried no pack, no blanket, no food or water, only a tall staff polished by years of use, its wood smooth as river stones, where countless fingers had rested through miles of unknown roads beneath his hand. His clothes were simple but worn by sun and wind, the fabric holding that pale, weathered look of travelers who belong more to the earth beneath them than to any village or market square, the kind of person who passes through rather than arriving anywhere. He asked no questions when he reached the well, only leaned on his staff while the bucket creaked up from its dark throat, the rope wet with coldness that smelled faintly of clay and iron as it swung slowly in the evening air. It was the children who first pointed to the cross on the hill, its shape black against the sky where the last streaks of sunset burned faintly behind it. the memory of light clinging stubbornly to the day's edge before slipping away altogether. The traveler watched it for a long while without speaking, his eyes reflecting that thin red glow that sometimes stays in the west after the sun itself has gone. The kind of light that feels more like memory than like fire. When at last he asked about it, his voice carried the hoarseness of wind over stone, a sound shaped by distance and quiet places, not loud yet carrying easily through the still air that always gathers before night fully arrives. They told him it had shone once more, only the night before, brighter than anyone remembered, though no one had climbed the hill since then, because the desert keeps its mysteries and the people have learned to leave them untouched. He nodded, as though this were exactly what he expected, not surprised, not eager, only listening the way roots listen to water deep underground, then thanked them with the small bow of someone long used to moving on before morning. But instead of taking the road east toward the next village, as strangers usually did, he carried his staff slowly toward the rise where the cross leaned eastward in its silence, his steps soft as though he walked across a sleeping body. The last of the evening colors drained from the sky as he climbed, the air cooling with that faint smell of stone after heat, the kind of sweetness only deserts know, like dust and wind, have learned to keep something tender hidden beneath. He reached the top before the moon had risen, the cross standing dark and ordinary now, only its rough timber catching a thin glimmer from the first stars opening above. The dry grass whispering faintly as wind turned across the hilltop. The villagers watched from below, though none followed, their fires flickering small and golden near the well, the smoke rising straight until it met the drifting layers of night where no one could see its shape any more. The traveler leaned his staff against the base of the cross and sat on the ground beside it, his back straight, his hands resting loosely on his knees, the posture of someone accustomed to waiting without impatience. The air around him cooled further as the moon climbed slowly above the eastern dunes, a pale coin spreading light across the empty miles, silvering the sand so the whole desert looked as though made of water, frozen midwave. You were told he did not move for hours, even when the wind freshened and the wood of the cross gave its slow, dry creak, like something old remembering itself, even when jackals cried far off among the rocks below the ridges. The glow began again some time after midnight, first a faint line along the horizontal beam, no brighter than breath against glass, then slowly deepening until the whole shape shone as though moonlight had slipped beneath its skin and was burning there softly. The villagers saw it from their doorways but did not climb, for it seemed the traveler had taken that place for the night, his figure small against the wide sky where stars spilled thick as seeds across black soil. He sat without turning toward the village lights, without raising his hands or bowing his head, only watching the glow as though it were an old companion returning after long absence, something he had always expected to find again. The desert wind carried thin scents of sage and cedar ash from dying fires below, mingling with the dry taste of sand on the air, the whole night breathing slowly like an animal asleep under its own heavy fur. Some said he stayed that way until the first pale wash of dawn began behind the hills, when the glow thinned little by little until only ordinary wood stood against the paling sky, its surface rough and splintered once more. The traveler rose then, lifting his staff with slow movements, as though every bone knew the shape of the ground beneath him, as though leaving that hill required permission from something older than wind or sun. He looked toward the village, but did not descend, turning instead to the east where the sun would rise. The sky there already faintly touched with that soft silver that comes before color, when the world seems made entirely of breath. By the time the first bell called the morning awake, he was only a moving shadow along the far road, the kind that fades even as you watch, leaving no prints on the hard earth behind him, only the memory of his shape against the light. No one ever learned his name or from where he came, and the villagers spoke of him the way they spoke of weather or wandering stars, things that appear when they will and vanish, without asking whether anyone wishes them to stay. But for many nights afterward, when the wind shifted at dusk and the cross leaned in its familiar silence, you found yourself watching the empty road, wondering if perhaps he would return when the glow rose again beneath the moon. And sometimes, when you dreamed of the hilltop, you thought you saw him there still, sitting with his staff beside the cross, the night flowing slowly around him like water around stone, waiting for something the desert alone could name. You remember the night the wind came down from the hills, long after the sun had slipped behind the dunes, carrying with it the smell of cool stone and faraway rain, though no cloud marked the wide desert sky above. The air had grown heavy through the day, pressing its heat into walls and earth until even the shadows clung lazily to corners, waiting for some breath of movement to lift them from the dust where they lay folded and still. By evening, the village had grown quiet, fires burning low in the doorways, the air sweet with the slow cooking of lentils and the faint, charred scent of flatbread edges crisping over the last tongues of flame beneath the iron pans. Children chased one another through the dusk until the first winds began curling through the thorn trees, stirring branches that had stood like black etchings against the pale sky, their dry leaves rattling with a sound like beads poured slowly through hollow hands. You felt it first along your arms, that coolness slipping between the folds of your robe like water finding cracks in rock, carrying a promise of change, though no storm announced itself beyond the faint brightening of the moon behind a thin veil of dust. The doors creaked in their frames as the gusts grew stronger, the wooden rafters of the meeting hall lifting their voices, one by one, until the whole roof hummed softly above the empty benches, as though the wind itself had chosen an instrument for the night. You walked there slowly after supper, drawn by that low music weaving between the walls, the path crunching beneath your sandals, the air growing cooler still as you passed the well where the bucket's rope tapped gently against stone with each wandering breath. The moon had risen fully by then, silvering the edges of the rooftops and the thorn branches, painting the whole village in pale light that smoothed away color until even the clay walls looked carved from the same quiet stone as the hills beyond. From the open doorway of the meeting hall came the long, hollow singing of the rafters, each gust bending the beams so they answered in low notes, a chorus built from age and wind and wood grown patient beneath the desert sun. You stepped inside and felt the coolness gather there, the air sliding through high windows, lifting small dust motes into spirals where they caught the moonlight like drifting embers rising from a fire long since gone to ash. The benches sat empty, their worn boards smelling faintly of smoke and old candles, the walls marked by years of hands pressing shadows into corners where even the wind could not reach to carry them away again. Above you the rafters groaned softly as the gusts thickened, the sound neither storm nor music, yet holding pieces of both. Like a voice too deep for words rising from some memory, the wood itself carried through all its seasons of sun and sand. You sat on the lowest bench and listened as the wind circled the hall, slipping through cracks in the shutters, weaving between the beams overhead, the whole room breathing in long, slow chords as though singing for its own ears alone. Now and then a gust found the right hollow among the roof planks, so the tone changed, a higher note sliding beneath the deeper ones, the way a stream sometimes finds a hidden stone and speaks differently for only a moment before continuing on. The air smelled of dust lifted from far roads, of dry grass bending somewhere beyond the walls, of coolness carried from places whose names no one in the village had spoken for years, because they lay too far across the open sand. Someone had left the old lantern hanging by the door, though no flame burned within it, its glass cloudy from nights of wind-blown grit, its metal frame cold beneath your hand when you reached out to still it where it swayed on its hook. The music above did not stop, only shifted as the gusts thickened and thinned, a language older than voices murmuring across the beams, while the moonlight silvered each curve of wood until the whole ceiling glowed like the inside of a shell. You thought then of the cross on the hill, how the wind must be touching its weathered beams, too, sliding through the split places where sun and rain had cracked it open, perhaps drawing the same low notes from its hollow places. Outside, the gusts lifted sand across the paths, so the ground seemed to flow in small streams where moonlight caught it, the dunes beyond changing shape grain by grain, while the thorn trees leaned together like people speaking in low, hurried voices. You stayed on the bench as the roof sang above you, feeling the notes through the wood beneath your feet, the vibrations carrying like water through channels, so even the floor seemed to breathe with the rhythm of wind circling the hall. At times it almost shaped itself into melody, rising and falling with a slowness that felt deliberate, as though the gusts leaned together like players sharing a song no one had taught them, but all somehow remembered. The hour grew late, the fires in the doorways sinking to thin threads of red light, the voices of the villagers gone quiet behind shutters, while the night itself seemed to wait, listening to the rafters carry their endless hymn. You leaned your head back against the wall and closed your eyes so the music filled the whole room behind them, the wind's breath threading through empty spaces like water through reeds, soft yet carrying the weight of all the miles it had crossed to reach you. Somewhere far off, a door banged once, then swung open with the next gust, but no one rose to close it, the sound vanishing quickly beneath the long notes above, as though the wind would not permit any other voice to linger. When you opened your eyes again, the moon had shifted toward the west, its light falling now across the floor in long silver paths where sand had gathered in small drifts near the threshold, the patterns delicate as though shaped by careful hands. The rafters still sang, though the gusts had softened, the music stretching thin now, like the last embers of a fire settling into ash, the tones drawing longer spaces between them until only single notes answered the night, one by one. You rose at last when the air stilled completely, the coolness folding itself back into corners, the hall returning to its long-held silence, as though nothing had passed through at all, as though the wind had borrowed the place only for a little while. Outside, the thorn trees stood motionless again, their leaves clinging to branches, as though no breath had touched them. The dunes smooth under the moon's fading silver, the well's rope hanging without movement beside its dark circle of water. The village lay quiet behind its shutters, smoke long vanished from the chimneys, the paths empty except for your own steps, pressing shallow marks. The wind no longer hurried to erase from the powdery dust beneath your sandals. And far off on the hill, the cross leaned where it always had, black against the paling sky. Its beams silent now, though you wondered whether the wind had sung there too, before carrying its music onward toward places no one would ever follow. You remember the small chapel at the edge of the village, its whitewashed walls faded by decades of sun until the paint lay chalky beneath your fingertips, the doors leaning slightly inward as though the whole building bowed gently toward the wind. It had stood there longer than anyone could say, its single bell long since cracked by some forgotten storm, so that now it only shivered faintly when struck, producing not music but a dry, broken sound like wind moving through old bones. The villagers used it rarely, except on nights when the sky looked troubled or when someone's child grew ill, for prayers seemed to carry more easily through its crooked windows where the wind gathered itself before crossing the open desert beyond. You had gone there one afternoon when the air smelled of distant rain, though none ever came, the horizon sharp beneath a pale sky and the earth warm under your sandals, each step raising thin puffs of dust that drifted like breath behind you. The door hinges groaned as you pushed them open, the sound hollow in the small stone room where sunlight slanted through the high, narrow windows, catching dust motes that turned slowly like tiny planets caught in their own silent orbits. Inside, the air carried the coolness of thick walls that had swallowed centuries of summer heat and held them in layered silence, so each breath you took tasted faintly of lime and stone and the faint, bitter sweetness of old candle smoke. At the far wall stood a table scarred by years of elbows and prayer books, its surface smoothed by countless palms, resting there while words rose upward like the smoke from the thin, waxy candles clustered in chipped holders at its edge. Beneath that table, half hidden by a frayed cloth whose pattern had long ago faded to pale threads, you found the old diary, its leather cover curled at the corners like dry leaves left too long in the sun. The binding creaked when you lifted it, dust rising in a faint breath from its surface, as though the book itself exhaled after years of waiting. The air carrying that unmistakable scent of paper gone brittle beneath the slow weight of time. You laid it open on the table where the sun caught its yellowed pages. The ink faded to the color of tea, but still legible, each line in the careful hand of someone who had once believed these words would outlast their own shadow. The first pages spoke of ordinary things, the planting of millet in dry seasons, the arrival of traveling merchants with dates and copper pots, the rare blessing of rain falling softly enough to gather in jars without turning the paths to mud. But as you turned further, the voice shifted, the sentences lengthening into something slower, as though whoever wrote them had begun to carry not just events, but the weight of watching them too closely, like someone listening for footsteps in a long corridor at night. One passage told of the cross on the hill, how it had been raised by hands now long forgotten, a marker for travelers lost among the dunes, when the old caravan road still wound past the village before the sands swallowed its stones. The writer spoke of nights when the cross seemed to hold light long after the moon had set, not bright enough to rouse the village, but just enough to make passing strangers pause, as though they had found a lantern left for them alone. You traced those lines slowly with your fingertip, feeling the slight roughness where the ink had sunk into the grain of the page, each word carrying the faint, dry sound of paper whispering beneath your skin in the stillness of the empty chapel. Further on, the entries grew less frequent, whole months leaping between them until the handwriting trembled. Letters uneven, as though written by someone whose hands had grown tired, or whose eyes strained against the fading light of evening. One of the last pages told of a night when a traveler waited beneath the glowing cross until dawn came and the light thinned away, though the writer admitted they could not remember whether it had truly happened or only come to them in dreams. You sat there for a long time with the diary open before you, the air carrying the faint coolness of stone walls, while outside the wind moved across the empty courtyard, scattering petals from the thorn flowers blooming late in the season. The candles beside you burned low in their holders, the wax pooling thick and soft around their bases, the flames leaning whenever a draught slipped through the windows, then straightening again, as if remembering their duty to hold still in prayer. When you closed the diary, the binding sighed softly, the sound folding into the quiet room where the dust floated through slanted light, where the bell above the door swayed on its rope, though no wind seemed strong enough to move it now. You returned the book beneath the cloth where you had found it, your fingers leaving faint streaks across its leather cover. The smell of dust and wax clinging to your hands like something the air itself wished you to carry away. Outside the chapel, the sunlight lay warm across the stones, though the wind had turned cool again, carrying that smell of rain from nowhere. The sky wide and empty above the desert, where no clouds gathered despite the promise written on the air. You walked back slowly through the quiet village with the sense of having listened to a voice speaking softly from another century, one that had watched the same hill, the same leaning cross, the same strange glow rising where no fire burned. That night when the wind rattled the shutters, you thought of the diary again, of its pages curling inward like old petals, of the hand that had written by candlelight words no one alive remembered speaking aloud to anyone at all. And long after the village fires died, you imagined the cross standing alone on its rise, the moonlight falling across its beams like pale ink writing itself again and again against the dark sky where no reader ever turned the page. You remember the evening when the camel driver came through the village, his caravan moving like a line of dark shadows against the low red light of the setting sun, the animals' bells clinking softly as though they carried echoes instead of sound. His face was carved by years of wind and salt, his eyes narrowed against horizons most people never saw, and he smelled faintly of leather and dust, and the dry sweetness of dates wrapped carefully in the packs he carried. You had been standing near the old well when he stopped to water his camels, their long necks bowing slowly as though each sip was a prayer, the ropes creaking while the buckets rose, dripping from the cool dark below. The villagers gathered as they always did when strangers arrived, their voices low and curious, but the camel driver spoke little, his words measured like someone accustomed to empty spaces where even the wind seemed too cautious to speak aloud. That night he accepted the small room near the chapel, the one with the uneven floor and the shutter that never quite closed. its wood warped by summers, until the wind played through it like the breath of a sleeping flute. You brought him water in a clay jar, still warm from the day's sun, and he nodded his thanks before sitting on the floor where the lamplight painted gold across his weathered hands, the shadows of his fingers stretching long against the wall. When the evening meal was finished and the fire burned low, he began to tell his tale in a voice so slow and deep it seemed to rise from somewhere beneath the years rather than from the man sitting before you. He spoke of the desert beyond the dunes you knew, the one whose nights burned colder than iron left too long in wind, where the stars gathered so thickly they seemed to drip silver into the black bowl of the sky. He told of journeys made when waterskins cracked from thirst before the next well appeared, when the heat rose in trembling curtains from the sand until even the horizon itself seemed to waver like a mirage too tired to hold its shape. His words carried the taste of distance, of places where the air smelled only of salt from hidden lakes long since dried to white scars, where silence pressed so heavily it felt like another sun lowering itself unseen across your shoulders. And then he spoke of the cross, the one standing on the hill near your village. Though he had not yet visited it, his story circling like wind, preparing itself before settling into the hollow between stones. He said, travelers spoke of its glow as far away as the market towns beyond the eastern ridges. Tales traded beside fires where no one cared whether they were true, so long as the night grew warmer with words. Some claimed the light came only when no eyes watched, appearing like a secret the desert kept for itself, while others swore it guided lost wanderers toward water or shelter, though none could say who first saw it blaze in darkness. The camel driver leaned closer then, the lamplight deepening the lines around his eyes, and told you of a man he once met near the salt flats, who claimed to have followed that glow across an entire night without rest. This man, he said, walked alone with only a flask of bitter tea and a scarf torn by wind, yet swore the cross burned softly ahead of him like a lantern carried by someone always just beyond the next rise of sand. When dawn came, the light vanished, leaving only the wooden beams, weathered by sun and wind, standing silent above a land where even the insects buried themselves before day's heat returned like a great hand, pressing everything flat again. You listened while the fire crackled low, the air growing cooler as night slipped along the edges of the room, carrying the faint smell of dust and dry grass through the warped shutter where the wind moved like a careful hand. The camel driver's voice slowed further, each word falling like small stones dropped into a well, spreading ripples through your thoughts until you could almost see that lonely figure following the glow, across miles of shifting sand beneath the heavy moon. He spoke of faith then, not the kind carried in books or prayers, but the quiet trust of someone who steps forward because the darkness leaves them no other path, because even a faint light is enough when the night grows too large. Outside the room, the camels shifted, their bells murmuring softly as though answering some question the wind had asked, their long shadows swaying across the courtyard under a sky where the stars burned sharp as grains of salt scattered on black cloth. When the tale ended, the fire was nearly gone, its last embers breathing faint orange against the stones, and the camel driver wrapped himself in his cloak with the patience of someone used to sleeping where no door ever fully closed. You left him there beneath the whispering shutter, and stepped into the cool night where the moon laid pale silver across the rooftops, where even the well seemed to hold its breath beneath the thin song of insects hidden among dry weeds. From the hill beyond the village, the cross rose faint against the stars, only a shape in the darkness now. But you carried his story with you like the taste of dust lingering on your tongue after miles of unbroken road. Long after the wind smoothed every footprint from the courtyard, you lay awake listening to the silent stretch between the walls, thinking of the man who followed light across a night with nothing but faith and empty sand for company. And you wondered whether the glow would come again when no one waited for it, whether it belonged not to the eyes watching, but to the desert itself, to the places where stories walked long before the first word was spoken aloud. You remember the woman who lived alone beside the old well, her small house crouched among tamarisk trees that sighed whenever the wind swept across the flats, their thin branches brushing one another like fingers exchanging secrets at dusk. Her roof was patched with palm thatch faded to the color of dry reeds, her walls made of clay that held the day's warmth deep inside, so that evenings always carried the faint breath of sun long after its light was gone. You would see her each morning lowering the bucket into the well, the rope frayed and knotted in places where time had worn it smooth, the water rising dark and cool before spilling quietly into the waiting clay jars. She always moved slowly, though not from age, but as though her days were stitched together by unhurried threads, each motion shaped by the patience of someone who had long ago learned to listen more than speak. Children whispered that she had once come from the western hills, a place of wind-carved stone and narrow paths where shadows clung like scarves at twilight. But no one knew for certain because she seldom told stories about herself. When strangers arrived seeking water or shade, she would pour the coolness into their cups without asking names, her face calm beneath the pale scarf she always wore, her eyes carrying that distant look of someone who keeps company with silence. You remember sitting on the low wall beside her once while she prepared tea over a fire of thorn branches, the smoke rising thin and fragrant, carrying the faint sweetness of desert resin through the bright air of late afternoon. She brewed the leaves slowly, letting the steam swirl upward like ghostly scarves twisting against the high blue sky. And the cups she handed out were chipped along the rims, yet held the warmth as though made to carry sunlight itself. It was during one of those evenings, when the horizon burned orange before fading into the violet hush of night, that she first spoke of the cross on the hill, as though mentioning something half-forgotten yet close to her heart. She said she had lived near the well for many years, longer than most could recall, and had seen the seasons roll across the desert like tides made of wind and dust instead of water. Yet the cross had always remained, through sandstorms that rattled shutters until the air itself felt sharpened, through summers when the earth cracked like old pottery beneath the sun's weight, through winters when thin rains softened the dunes to dark ochre. The cross never fell. Her voice was soft, shaped by the rasp of years and the dryness of desert air, yet carried a steadiness like wind passing through a canyon, rising and falling in tones that felt carved by stone rather than spoken aloud. She said sometimes at night she would fetch water long after others slept, and on certain evenings when the air grew strangely still, she would see a pale glow gather faintly along the beams of the cross above the village. It was never bright enough to cast shadows, only a trembling shimmer, as though moonlight had chosen to linger there, even on nights when the moon itself lay hidden behind veils of wandering cloud. Once, she told you, she carried her jar back along the path and found the glow waiting above the hill, steady and patient. The wood shining softly, though no fire burned, no hand lifted a lantern, no star fell nearby. She had not felt fear then, only the hush that comes when the world grows briefly larger than your thoughts. When you sense the earth turning slowly beneath skies too wide for words to fill completely. The tea cooled between you as she spoke, the wind combing gently through the tamarisk branches, their shadows stretching across the packed earth like thin nets cast by unseen fishermen hauling the night closer. She said the light never lasted long, vanishing like breath fading from glass. Yet each time it left, she felt the air hold some quiet echo of its passing, as though the desert itself remembered even when no eyes watched. You thought then of how she lived with only the well for company, hearing the bucket rise and fall like the slow heartbeat of the earth, the water closing softly after each draw as though sealing secrets below its dark surface. Her days must have passed like the drifting of sand across old tracks, marked only by the sun's climb and descent, the calls of distant birds, the rare arrival of travelers stopping for water before continuing toward horizons she would never follow. Yet, when she spoke of the cross, her eyes held a glimmer, not of wonder exactly, but of recognition, as though the light belonged to the same silence that kept her company through seasons measured by wind and the turning of stars. You finished your tea while the last warmth bled from the clay cup into your hands. The sky above the dunes, deepening to a color, caught between fading rose and approaching night, that hour when even the air seems to wait. Before you left, she filled your flask from the well, the rope sliding through her hands with a sound like old fabric tearing slowly, the water cool against your palms where drops gathered before falling darkly to the ground. She said no one truly owns water in the desert, just as no one owns the wind or the shifting dunes, and perhaps the cross was the same, belonging to nothing yet carrying something none could name whenever its glow returned. As you walked back toward the village, the stars opened quietly above you, their light cold and far, yet scattered so thickly it seemed the sky itself might crack and spill silver across the waiting sand below. From the hill the cross stood dark now, only a shape against starlight. But her words stayed with you like the taste of smoke clinging to your tongue after tea brewed slowly above thornwood fire. That night, lying awake beneath the uneven rafters of your room, you wondered whether the glow she saw was meant only for those who lived quietly enough to notice, those who carried water, brewed tea, and listened more than they spoke. And you thought of the woman beside the well, her small house among the tamarisk trees, the patient rope sliding through her hands, the bucket rising from darkness, carrying coolness shaped by stone, time, and silence, older than memory itself. You remember the evening when the pilgrim came walking from the far horizon, his figure first appearing like a wavering thread of shadow against the molten gold of the dying sun, moving slowly as though the earth itself resisted each step he took. His robe was the color of sand after rain, pale and heavy with dust that clung to its folds like memories unwilling to loosen their grip, while his staff leaned slightly from years of being carried through winds that erased footprints behind him. You saw him pause at the edge of the dunes before the village lights began to flicker. The the sky above him wide and bruised with the deepening violet of twilight. His face turned toward the hill where the cross waited silently. He stood there for a long time without moving, the wind stirring his robe so it breathed around him like some weary creature, and even from a distance you sensed he was listening to something too faint for ordinary ears to hear. When he finally descended toward the well where the tamarisk trees whispered, his steps carried no urgency, only the slow rhythm of someone who has measured his life in distances crossed beneath. Suns that burned differently from one land to the next. The woman at the well gave him water without question, her hands steady as she poured from the clay jar into the small metal cup he carried tied to his belt, its surface scratched by years of thirst being eased in many places. He drank without lifting his eyes, as though the water itself held stories he was trying to read. The way coolness ran over his tongue, carrying the taste of limestone and shadow, gathered deep below the earth's cracked surface. Afterward he thanked her with a nod and turned to watch the hill again, where the cross stood black against a sky sliding toward night, its outline holding the faintest rim of light from the day's last embers along the horizon. You joined him then, drawn by something in his stillness, the way he stood with his staff planted lightly in the sand, as though it had grown there, as though neither of you wished to break the moment with unnecessary words. He spoke finally, his voice low and shaped by many accents, carrying the kind of weariness that is not complaint but simple record. Like wind telling of the deserts it has crossed without asking anyone to follow or believe its story. He said he had come from the mountains beyond the salt flats, a place where the air thinned until breaths felt carved from glass, and where nights gathered stars so fiercely the sky itself seemed to tremble beneath their weight. Along the way he had passed abandoned watchtowers, sinking slowly into sand, caravan tracks fading until they became no more than wandering lines of stone, and villages where only wind lived now, rattling empty shutters like bones learning to sing. Yet each place had spoken to him in its own tongue of silence, he said. And more than once he had heard whispers of a cross standing on a hill where light gathered though no flame was ever seen nearby. He had not hurried because pilgrimage was never meant for haste, only for the slow shedding of miles until the body moved like a thought, through landscapes too vast for any map to carry completely between its folded edges. Now he stood at last beneath the same sky where the cross waited, his eyes reflecting the faint stirrings of starlight, as if gathering pieces of night to carry inside himself for whatever journey remained beyond this one. You remember how he asked whether the stories were true, whether light sometimes rose along the beams though no torch was lifted, no lantern swung, no fire built by hands that sought to be remembered for their warmth. The woman at the well only shrugged softly, her bracelets clinking like distant chimes, and said the desert kept its own counsel, offering glimpses the way wind offers shapes in drifting sand, visible until the next gust decides to change them. The pilgrim listened as though such words did not disappoint him, as though uncertainty was the only true companion of those who travel far enough to learn that answers often vanish, like water sinking back into thirsty ground. When night spread fully across the dunes, deep and cool as indigo cloth, the three of you watched the hill where the cross rose dark against a sky folding itself around new stars, bright as frost beneath invisible moonlight. It was then, he said quietly, that he hoped the light might come, not for proof or wonder, but simply because he had carried the thought of it across too many miles to leave without seeing what silence sometimes held. You waited together while wind stroked the tamarisk leaves until they whispered like monks turning thin pages in a monastery where no bell had rung for centuries. The well water gleaming faintly beside you like polished obsidian under starlight. Far off, a jackal cried once, then nothing moved except the night itself. Yet the pilgrim's face remained turned toward the cross, patient as someone reading a script written across the sky in letters too faint for hurried eyes to find. No light came that night, only the slow deepening of stars, until the heavens felt heavy with their own brightness. And still he did not seem troubled, as though he understood that journeys sometimes ended not with signs but with stillness. Before sleeping beneath the tamarisk trees, he told you he would stay another day, perhaps longer, because time mattered little to someone who had walked beneath suns and moons enough to know that waiting itself was a kind of arrival. In the quiet before dawn you woke once and saw him sitting upright, staff across his knees, watching the hill as though the coming light of morning might reveal what darkness had kept hidden. Yet his face remained calm, almost grateful. When the sun finally climbed and spilled gold across the dunes, the cross stood plain and ordinary against the brightening sky, its wood weathered, its shadow falling sharply like any other thing rooted to earth beneath the returning weight of day. The pilgrim rose then, dusted sand from his robe, and said nothing except to thank the woman once more for water, his voice carrying the gentleness of someone who had found what he came for, even if no one else understood it. He left walking slowly toward the northern horizon, where heat was already beginning to rise in wavering curtains, his staff leaving small, deep marks behind him that the wind would soon erase, like words written only for the sky to read. And you watched him go, wondering whether the glow he sought had been waiting all along, not on the cross above the hill, but in the quiet he carried with him beneath the endless breathing of the desert wind. You remember the evening when the pilgrim came walking from the far horizon, his figure first appearing like a wavering thread of shadow against the molten gold of the dying sun, moving slowly as though the earth itself resisted each step he took. His robe was the color of sand after rain, pale and heavy with dust that clung to its folds like memories unwilling to loosen their grip, while his staff leaned slightly from years of being carried through winds that erased footprints behind him. You saw him pause at the edge of the dunes before the village lights began to flicker, the sky above him wide and bruised with the deepening violet of twilight. His face turned toward the hill where the cross waited silently. He stood there for a long time without moving, the wind stirring his robe so it breathed around him like some weary creature, and even from a distance you sensed he was listening to something too faint for ordinary ears to hear. When he finally descended toward the well where the tamarisk trees whispered, his steps carried no urgency, only the slow rhythm of someone who has measured his life in distances crossed beneath suns that burned differently from one land to the next. The woman at the well gave him water without question, her hands steady as she poured from the clay jar into the small metal cup he carried tied to his belt, its surface scratched by years of thirst being eased in many places. He drank without lifting his eyes, as though the water itself held stories he was trying to read. The way coolness ran over his tongue, carrying the taste of limestone and shadow, gathered deep below the earth's cracked surface. Afterward he thanked her with a nod and turned to watch the hill again, where the cross stood black against a sky sliding toward night, its outline holding the faintest rim of light from the day's last embers along the horizon. You joined him then, drawn by something in his stillness, the way he stood with his staff planted lightly in the sand, as though it had grown there, as though neither of you wished to break the moment with unnecessary words. He spoke finally, his voice low and shaped by many accents, carrying the kind of weariness that is not complaint but simple record. Like wind telling of the deserts it has crossed without asking anyone to follow or believe its story. He said he had come from the mountains beyond the salt flats, a place where the air thinned until breaths felt carved from glass, and where nights gathered stars so fiercely the sky itself seemed to tremble beneath their weight. Along the way he had passed abandoned watchtowers, sinking slowly into sand, caravan tracks fading until they became no more than wandering lines of stone, and villages where only wind lived now, rattling empty shutters like bones learning to sing. Yet each place had spoken to him in its own tongue of silence, he said. And more than once he had heard whispers of a cross standing on a hill where light gathered though no flame was ever seen nearby. He had not hurried because pilgrimage was never meant for haste, only for the slow shedding of miles until the body moved like a thought, through landscapes too vast for any map to carry completely between its folded edges. Now he stood at last beneath the same sky where the cross waited, his eyes reflecting the faint stirrings of starlight, as if gathering pieces of night to carry inside himself for whatever journey remained beyond this one. You remember how he asked whether the stories were true, whether light sometimes rose along the beams though no torch was lifted, no lantern swung, no fire built by hands that sought to be remembered for their warmth. The woman at the well only shrugged softly, her bracelets clinking like distant chimes, and said the desert kept its own counsel, offering glimpses the way wind offers shapes in drifting sand, visible until the next gust decides to change them. The pilgrim listened as though such words did not disappoint him, as though uncertainty was the only true companion of those who travel far enough to learn that answers often vanish, like water sinking back into thirsty ground. When night spread fully across the dunes, deep and cool as indigo cloth, the three of you watched the hill where the cross rose dark against a sky folding itself around new stars, bright as frost beneath invisible moonlight. It was then, he said quietly, that he hoped the light might come, not for proof or wonder, but simply because he had carried the thought of it across too many miles to leave without seeing what silence sometimes held. You waited together while wind stroked the tamarisk leaves until they whispered like monks turning thin pages in a monastery where no bell had rung for centuries, the well water gleaming faintly beside you like polished obsidian under starlight. Far off, a jackal cried once, then nothing moved except the night itself. Yet the pilgrim's face remained turned toward the cross, patient as someone reading a script written across the sky in letters too faint for hurried eyes to find. No light came that night, only the slow deepening of stars, until the heavens felt heavy with their own brightness. And still he did not seem troubled, as though he understood that journeys sometimes ended not with signs but with stillness. Before sleeping beneath the tamarisk trees, he told you he would stay another day, perhaps longer, because time mattered little to someone who had walked beneath suns and moons enough to know that waiting itself was a kind of arrival. In the quiet before dawn you woke once, and saw him sitting upright, staff across his knees, watching the hill as though the coming light of morning might reveal what darkness had kept hidden. Yet his face remained calm, almost grateful. When the sun finally climbed and spilled gold across the dunes, the cross stood plain and ordinary against the brightening sky. Its wood weathered, its shadow falling sharply, like any other thing rooted to earth beneath the returning weight of day. The pilgrim rose then, dusted sand from his robe, and said nothing except to thank the woman once more for water, his voice carrying the gentleness of someone who had found what he came for, even if no one else understood it. He left walking slowly toward the northern horizon, where heat was already beginning to rise in wavering curtains, his staff leaving small, deep marks behind him that the wind would soon erase, like words written only for the sky to read. And you watched him go, wondering whether the glow he sought had been waiting all along, not on the cross above the hill, but in the quiet he carried with him beneath the endless breathing of the desert wind. You remember waking early that morning to a sky brushed faintly with pink and lilac, the air cool against your skin as though carrying a quiet promise, and noticing first the distant sound of water you had long ceased to hear. The river, once nothing more than cracked clay beds and pale dust where reeds grew stiff and dry, now murmured softly beneath thin currents of clear water, reflecting the sky in shifting silver ribbons that moved like silk along its shallow banks. You walked slowly toward it, feeling the sand damp beneath your bare feet where last night's dew had settled, the cold grains pressing gently between toes like memory pressed softly into your hands without urgency or demand. The tamarisk trees along its edge leaned low as though bowing to the returning current, their roots kissing the water for the first time in years, and you inhaled the fresh scent of wet earth, moss, and something faintly like honey rising from the hidden depths. You noticed small fish darting beneath the surface, their scales catching the early light like scattered fragments of glass, while dragonflies skimmed above in glimmering arcs, wings vibrating so quickly they seemed to hum a quiet tune you could almost feel in your chest. The villagers had begun to gather silently along the banks, their bare feet pressed into soft mud, eyes lowered, as though this sudden gift of water belonged not to anyone in particular, but to the earth itself, and everyone simply wished to witness it in reverent stillness. You cupped your hands and touched the water, letting it slip coolly through your fingers, tasting faint minerals and the faint sweetness of desert seeds carried from somewhere upstream. The sensation so simple yet so profound it seemed to anchor you to the world in a way you had forgotten. The cross on the hill stood beyond the river, dark against the pale blue morning, yet today its presence felt different, somehow heavier with acknowledgement, as though it had observed centuries of dry summers and now bore witness to this sudden life with gentle approval. A woman approached quietly, carrying a small clay jar, and knelt beside the bank to fill it, her hands steady, the droplets spilling lightly over the edge and back into the river. The sound so faint it almost became part of the morning wind that had returned soft and teasing along the dunes. You noticed the reflection of the cross in the moving water, stretched and trembling in slow ripples that shimmered like a secret kept just beneath the surface, and it struck you that the desert had waited patiently for this moment, allowing light, water, and memory to meet again. The river sang in its own way, a slow and subtle melody formed from stones beneath the shallow current. Reeds brushing one another with each small ripple, and the hum of insects waking to day, carrying music too quiet to hear without leaning close to the earth itself. You felt the warmth of the sun begin to grow across your shoulders, brushing sand and grass with soft amber light, and the gentle heat mingled with the coolness of the water. A balance that seemed to hold all the hours and lifetimes of the desert in one single, unhurried moment. The pilgrim from the northern dunes had arrived as well, his robe still carrying the faint dust of long roads, and he knelt by the riverbank in silence, letting the water fill his hands as though it had come to him precisely at the time he needed it, neither earlier nor later. He raised his face to the rising sun and inhaled the scent of returning life, the faint hum of flowing water, and the delicate fragrance of reeds wet with morning dew. And you saw that in his eyes a memory of all the barren rivers he had crossed flickered briefly before dissolving into peace. The camel driver came past quietly, leading one camel and letting it drink, its soft, rough tongue catching the water and stirring gentle waves that lapped at the banks, each ripple spreading slowly across the river like the first words of a long-forgotten song. You watched how the villagers dipped jars and hands, sharing the water without speaking, smiles quiet and small. For today there was no need for stories, only acknowledgement of life returning, and a sense that the desert had finally released a secret it had held in silence for too long. Along the bank, small flowers that had lain dormant pushed gently through mud and sand, petals unfolding like delicate whispers to greet the sun, their colors muted yet alive, so fragile in the vast openness that their mere presence felt miraculous, a soft punctuation in the quiet world. You noticed the reflection of the clouds sliding slowly across the water, silver and gray streaks moving above the mirrored image of the cross, and you imagined the sky itself bending low to drink, as though honoring the way life could return even after long, patient waiting. The old diary from the chapel came to mind, the lines describing distant rains, the small triumphs of water over dryness, and you thought how those words, written so long ago, were now alive in these currents, as though time itself had chosen to join in the river's quiet celebration. The air carried a new kind of scent, rich and alive, mingling earth and water with faint reeds and pollen, and you realized that the desert had shifted its voice again, offering a song that only those who paused long enough could hear, one shaped by life, patience, and sudden return. You lingered for hours, hands in the water, toes pressed into soft mud, the river moving slowly, reflecting the cross, the sky, and everything in between, until even the sun's warmth felt like part of the current, moving steadily through everything it touched. When you finally turned back toward the village, your robe damp at the hem, the river still murmuring quietly behind you, the cross on the hill appeared somehow closer, its shadow falling along the river's curve like a reminder that light and water often came to those who waited quietly. And as you walked, feeling the soft press of returning wind against your back, you carried with you the knowledge that deserts, like hearts, sometimes only release life after long, patient silence, and that even when no one watches, miracles find their way home again. You remember the first night the lanterns appeared, not carried by any hand, not guided by the footsteps of a villager, but moving softly across the dunes as though they had learned to float by the same patience that shapes wind and sand. The air was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of stone and sage. And the lanterns glimmered faintly in pale amber, their light not bright enough to burn shadows, yet steady enough to make the dark seem alive with quiet memory. You watched them drift along the ridges, weaving slowly between tamarisk trees and the small hill where the cross stood, the flame inside each lantern moving with a life of its own, bending slightly as though breathing with the rhythm of the desert. The first lantern paused near the well, swaying gently as if to say hello, its reflection shimmering across the surface of the water. And you thought how strange it was to see something so deliberate, yet so untethered in a place where nothing usually moved without reason. You followed its slow drift across the sand, toes pressing into the cool grains, feeling the faint vibration of the earth beneath each step as the lanterns moved in silent procession, their light touching the dunes like fingers brushing an unplayed harp. The lanterns passed the houses of the village, slipping past windows where shutters were closed and sleepers dreamed, as though carrying messages meant only for the hills, the well, and the cross, ignoring human curiosity with a gentle, unfathomable wisdom. You noticed how they glimmered differently on each dune, some pale and silver, some warm as candle wax, their lights bending with the slope of the sand, tracing shapes that seemed to form stories older than the village itself, whispered only to the watching night. The cross on the hill became the center of their dance, the lanterns weaving slow arcs around its base, pausing occasionally as if acknowledging it, bowing in a light too quiet for eyes accustomed to ordinary fire, carrying the hush of desert patience. You knelt by the sand and felt the cool grains press against your palms, watching one lantern drift so close that you could feel its warmth without touching, the faint scent of oil rising from it mingling with the crisp night air and the distant smell of dry tamarisk leaves. The desert around you seemed to breathe in rhythm with the lanterns, dunes lifting and falling under unseen currents, the small sounds of sand settling beneath their passage, blending into the low hum of the night, making the world feel slower, softer, as though time itself had paused. A breeze stirred suddenly, faint and careful, ruffling the edges of your robe and the thin hairs on your arms, and the lanterns responded, their lights swaying as if acknowledging the wind's touch, yet continuing on their path as though bound by some unseen compass. You thought of the pilgrims, the camel driver, the woman by the well, and the quiet nights where wind refused to blow, realizing how these lanterns carried the memory of every person who had ever looked toward the cross in hope, and every footstep taken toward water, shelter, or prayer. One lantern lingered near the top of the hill, hovering a few breaths above the crossbeam, moving slowly in circles like a dancer practicing alone, its amber glow softening the hard lines of the wood, giving it a warmth you had never noticed in daylight or moonlight alone. You felt a gentle pull in your chest, a quiet recognition, as though the lantern's movements mirrored the slow rhythm of your own heartbeat, reminding you that the desert, the cross, and its wandering light had always been part of the same breathing pattern, just waiting for someone patient enough to see. A soft scraping sound drew your eyes to a nearby dune, where small stones shifted in the lantern light. Yet there was no wind, no animal, only the faint movement of the earth, responding to the invisible weight of illumination and care that the lanterns carried. You followed them further, across shallow ridges, where shadows pooled and evaporated slowly in their glow, noticing that the light always seemed to find paths where the sand's texture changed, highlighting patterns too subtle for ordinary eyes to notice without patient watching. The lanterns paused near the dry bed of the river, circling once before dipping lightly over the water, their reflections shimmering like scattered stars trembling on the surface. And you realized how the river's long absence had made its return even more miraculous beneath their careful illumination. You remembered the night the wind had refused to blow, the silence pressing down until stars seemed heavy. And you understood then that these lanterns traveled alone, because the desert had learned to wait for moments where their presence could be fully seen and quietly understood. By the time the moon reached its apex, the lanterns had completed their slow journey, lingering for a final instant near the hilltop cross, then drifting gently toward the horizon where the sky deepened to indigo, leaving you with the sense that their visit was a benediction rather than a display. You walked back toward the village slowly, each step soft against the sand, the faint warmth of lantern light lingering on your skin as though imprinted, carrying a quiet promise that life, memory, and faith continued their slow, patient rhythm beyond what the eyes could see. That night, lying beneath your thin blanket and listening to the desert breathe around the village, you imagined the lanterns still moving across dunes far beyond the hill, traveling alone but never lost, carrying the hush of centuries, the soft pulse of wind, and the quiet glow of the cross. And you understood in that gentle half-sleep that some lights never wait for hands to hold them, and some glows only shine fully when the world is silent enough to notice, and that patience, like the desert itself, is the keeper of all unseen miracles. You remember the night the messenger arrived, his presence subtle as a shadow slipping across sand at twilight, and how he seemed carried not by feet but by the soft unfolding of the desert itself, gliding quietly under the first hints of moonlight. His robe brushed the ground like drifting smoke, pale and thin, catching the starlight and bending it into long, delicate streaks that disappeared behind him as if he were drawing the night across the dunes with invisible hands. You felt his approach before you saw him fully, a gentle vibration through the sand beneath your bare feet, a slow resonance like a heartbeat carried from the far hills, telling you that something patient, deliberate, and ancient had come to visit. The air held a faint scent of dry thyme and stone, and when he passed you, it lingered on your skin like a quiet benediction, the aroma mingling with the cool night breeze, soft against your cheeks and curling around the small hairs on your arms. He stopped at the crest of the dune nearest the cross, the moon illuminating his face just enough for you to see eyes that held the stillness of deserts, walked in endless loops, reflecting distant stars, as though he had memorized their patterns long ago. You realized he carried nothing tangible, no staff, no jar, only the slow rhythm of his breath. And yet you sensed he had a purpose, moving with care toward the cross as though he had come to deliver something the world could not speak aloud. The stars above were bright, scattered with the clarity of desert nights, yet he seemed to whisper to them, words carried in a language that touched the edges of memory, brushing your ears with sounds too faint to catch, yet familiar enough to feel like home. The cross stood silent against the sky, dark and tall, and yet the messenger's presence seemed to awaken it, the still wood leaning slightly into the glow of distant moonlight, as if recognizing the one who had come to speak to what the night had long held in shadow. You knelt in the sand, feeling the grains cold and soft beneath your fingers, listening to the faint whispering that carried through the night air, the subtle movement of invisible syllables drifting toward the stars, as if the universe itself waited for a reply. Somewhere behind you, the river murmured faintly in its return, and the tamarisk trees rustled gently, though no wind blew, their leaves trembling in a pattern almost like applause, acknowledging the messenger without sound, allowing the night to speak through motion alone. You wondered if he had always been coming, traveling unseen across dunes and ridges, passing villages and dried wells, collecting whispers from every traveler who had looked toward the cross, and sending them onward to the heavens in soft, unbroken streams. His voice, when it rose even briefly, was like a breeze moving through hollow reeds, a resonance that stirred the air without breaking its stillness, carrying memories, prayers, and faint longings from those who had paused to notice the desert's quiet miracles. You watched as he raised his arms slowly, palms open toward the sky, and the faintest glow, almost imperceptible, gathered along the cross, soft as a sigh, bending the edges of shadow and light, so that the wood seemed to shimmer with patience itself rather than fire. The stars flickered gently, almost as if listening, their points of light pulsing in harmony with the whispering words that traveled upward. And you realized that the messenger's language was one of intention, patience, and attention, the kind that the desert recognized above all else. He knelt then, palms resting lightly on the sand, and closed his eyes, as though folding himself into the earth, while the cross and stars held their place above him in quiet vigil. A triangle of attention linking sand, wood, and sky in a ceremony without audience or applause. You felt the coolness of the night air press closer to your skin, carrying the faint scent of distant rain, the minerals of stone, and the subtle sweetness of desert flowers, and for a moment everything seemed woven together, earth, sky, wood, light, and breath. The whispering rose again, soft and melodic, threading through your thoughts as if memory itself had taken voice, reminding you of every quiet night spent beneath the cross, every soft, windless evening, every star that had burned in patient constancy over the dunes. You realized that the messenger carried nothing to the cross that it did not already possess, no fire, no water, no word, only a reflection, a mirror for the desert's patience, a subtle acknowledgement that silence can be its own kind of communion. The lanterns from nights before seemed to shimmer faintly in the distance, their light small and wandering, moving as if guided by the messenger's whispers, a chorus of soft illumination responding to a call to quiet to name, yet impossible to ignore. Time stretched and folded, each moment flowing into the next, carrying the feeling of stillness that pressed against your chest and made your heartbeat feel like part of the earth's own rhythm, steady, quiet, and patient, like a long memory remembered at last. The messenger rose at last, his movements slow, deliberate, and graceful, and the stars seemed to lean closer, catching the faintest glimmer of a smile that had not been meant for you alone, yet touched your heart as if it had. He turned toward the northern dunes, walking softly over the sand, leaving no footprints, carrying only whispers for the sky. And you realized that some visitors come not to stay, but to remind us of things we have always known but seldom notice. The cross remained beneath the night, dark and silent, yet somehow deeper, steadier, as though the messenger had left a trace of attention behind. And you understood that some lights shine not because someone watches, but because someone listens, even when alone. You lay back in the sand afterward, inhaling the faint scent of earth and night, the whisper of the messenger echoing lightly in your mind, and you felt the calm pulse of the desert under your body, holding you gently in the rhythm of memory, time, and quiet reverence. And you knew, as the stars hung still and bright above, that some visits leave no mark but an echo, some whispers pass unseen, and some patience, like the desert itself, waits in silence until someone has learned to listen fully, without hurry or expectation. You wake before dawn, the desert air soft against your skin, carrying the faint scent of stone and dry sage, and notice the first pale streaks of light reaching across the valley, like a whisper of memory brushing against the hills. The horizon glows faintly, a tender wash of pink and gold that melts slowly into the deep blue of night, still clinging to the higher dunes. And you feel the cool sand beneath your feet shift slightly, as if breathing with the coming sun. The cross on the hill stands dark, yet unyielding, its silhouette etched against the softening sky, and you imagine how many dawns it has witnessed, each one delicate and fleeting, yet carrying the same quiet insistence that time itself bends for light to rise. A faint breeze begins to stir, moving in lazy arcs through tamarisk branches, carrying a hint of moisture from distant rocks warmed by yesterday's sun, and you inhale deeply, letting the cold and warmth mingle across your skin. A subtle reminder of the desert's slow, patient rhythm. Shadows stretch and lengthen across the valley floor, soft as woven silk, and you notice how the smallest ridges catch light differently, revealing hidden patterns in the sand that only appear when you pause long enough to see the world waking with gentle insistence. The first bird calls pierce the quiet, a soft, tremulous song that moves across the dunes like a ribbon, delicate enough to stir the heart and yet steady, rooted in the desert's ancient memory, a hymn that belongs to neither day nor night alone. You walk slowly toward the dry riverbed, toes sinking into the cool sand, the faint sound of returning water beneath its surface merging with the rustle of leaves, the occasional insect hum, and the distant, steady shimmer of the cross on the hill standing witness. Light bends across the valley in slow ribbons, brushing rocks, shrubs, and sand into muted golds and pale ambers, and you feel the warmth spread across your shoulders like a gentle hand, the desert offering itself fully without words, only the tender insistence of illumination. A small flower blooms unseen among stones, its petals delicate and damp with dew, and you pause to notice its fragile color, a quiet echo of life returning, subtle yet luminous, thriving quietly in a valley long forgotten, yet never entirely empty of memory. The cross begins to catch the light itself, soft rays brushing the edges of wood, giving it a glow that is neither fire nor reflection, but something older, a quiet recognition of presence and patience, the way certain things shine simply because they have endured. The air smells faintly of warmed stone and wet sand, the subtle scent of life carried in tiny reeds and distant tamarisk, and you feel the interplay of warmth and coolness across your skin. A gentle lesson in the desert's slow, exacting way of teaching presence. You notice the lanterns from nights past resting quietly on distant ridges, their lights extinguished now, yet still visible in the soft traces of reflection upon dew-damp sand, a reminder that movement, like memory, leaves a lingering impression even when the moment has passed. The first traveler emerges from the northern dunes, his robe catching the morning light in long folds, and he pauses at the valley's edge, eyes lowered to drink in the quiet miracle of the dawn, as though waiting for the cross to speak in its own patient, steady language. You kneel beside a small pool of water near the riverbed, cupping the reflection of the first light, the sky's pale pink mirrored in still liquid, and feel the fragile perfection of the moment, the delicate connection of water, sand, light, and the ancient cross observing without need. Shadows begin to shorten as the sun climbs, but the desert's pulse remains slow and gentle, and you feel yourself drawn into its rhythm, each heartbeat and breath aligning with the soft unfolding of dawn, carrying the quiet knowledge that even forgotten valleys awaken with patience and care. A gentle warmth settles across your cheeks and arms, mingling with the lingering cool of the riverbed's sand, and you hear the faint, almost imperceptible hum of life in every stone, leaf, and blade of grass, a symphony woven into the quiet tapestry of first light. The cross now stands bathed in early rays, neither shouting nor demanding attention, but glowing softly as though acknowledging the arrival of another day, and you feel a subtle thrill of recognition, a sense that the desert holds many such moments, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. The valley, long neglected, begins to reveal textures and shades invisible at night, the subtle curves of dunes, the delicate imprint of tiny creatures' passage, and the interplay of shadows and sunlight painting slow, intricate patterns only visible to those who pause fully in observation. You inhale the cool, faintly mineral-scented air, noticing how it carries the warmth of sun-warmed stone, the faint sweetness of desert flowers, and the enduring fragrance of tamarisk, blending them into a scent that is both ephemeral and eternal, holding the memory of countless dawns. The lanterns from distant ridges flicker faintly in residual dew, their memory captured in tiny reflections across the riverbed. The first light revealing what was invisible before, a delicate reminder that attention and observation are themselves a kind of illumination, gentle and patient. You feel the soft press of wind now brushing against your hair and robe, carrying with it whispers of distant valleys and forgotten dunes, and you sense that the first light has always moved this way, touching, teaching, and unfolding slowly to those willing to lie quietly beneath its glow. The cross catches the sun fully at last, its shadow stretching long across the valley floor, a quiet sentinel in the early light, and you feel the hush of the desert settle around you like a blanket, carrying with it the knowledge that time and patience shine just as surely as any flame. You rise slowly, feeling the cool earth give beneath your hands one last time, and look back at the valley, the cross, and the riverbed, knowing that each dawn, however unnoticed, leaves a gift of calm and presence, a quiet illumination for those willing to walk softly and remember. And you carry that first light in your memory, feeling its warmth and slow unfolding inside you, knowing that even in the deepest silence, in the valley long forgotten, the desert offers gentle guidance, patience, and the quiet glow of enduring hope. You remember walking across the dunes in the hour before midnight, the air cool and dry against your skin, carrying the faint scent of tamarisk and stones, and feeling as though the desert itself had drawn a long, slow breath to prepare you for what it wanted to share. The cross on the hill loomed quietly in the moonlight, its dark silhouette softened by the silver wash of night, and you sensed that the stillness around it was not empty but full, vibrating gently with a sound too subtle for ordinary ears to hear. You paused to kneel in the sand, letting your hands sink into the cool grains, feeling the faint texture of wind-polished stone beneath, and listened closely as the silence began to shift, revealing layers of a hum that resonated faintly through the dunes. It was not a noise, not exactly, but a vibration, a quiet melody threaded through the wind and the sand, the tamarisk leaves and the distant hills. As if the desert had learned to sing in whispers only those patient enough could hear. You breathed slowly, drawing in the mineral scent of dry earth mixed with the faint sweetness of night-blooming flowers, and noticed how the cross seemed to tremble subtly in response to the quiet song, its presence amplifying the soft resonance until it filled your chest. A faint movement caught your eye. A small rodent scuttling through shadows, a lizard sliding across warm stone, each motion contributing to the hum, unnoticed yet essential, part of a delicate rhythm that had existed long before any footsteps marked the sand. You felt the moonlight brush your shoulders like a silken shawl, cool and gentle, and the hum grew subtly, interwoven with the faint brush of night wind. A sound felt more than heard, pressing lightly against your skin, moving through your body in quiet, deliberate waves. The cross on the hill began to glimmer in a way the moon alone could not account for, edges soft, shadowed, and luminous at once, as though the desert's hum had awakened it, and the silence itself seemed to vibrate with recognition of what had endured in solitude. You leaned closer to the sand, fingertips brushing the surface lightly, and felt a faint warmth, almost imperceptible, rising from beneath, as though the earth were humming beneath you too, carrying stories and memories long buried and now echoing softly in this tender hour. A flock of distant birds moved low across the horizon, wings catching faint starlight, and you noticed how even their motions seemed tuned to the desert's subtle song, each flap harmonizing with the hum, a quiet orchestra without conductor, rehearsal, or audience. You inhaled again, savoring the mixture of cool night air, faint floral sweetness, and mineral dust, and realized that the hum was not separate from you, not an outside sound, but a current running through your body, the desert and you in a quiet, slow communion. The lanterns from nights past seemed to flicker faintly along distant ridges, their light responding almost imperceptibly to the hum, shadows stretching and bending, as if the desert's music guided them across dunes in patterns only visible to those who paused fully and watched in silence. You imagined the long lineage of travelers who had walked these sands, the cross, witnessing every quiet footstep, and understood that the hum had always been there, beneath noise, beneath wind, beneath longing, waiting for someone patient enough to hear it with their whole being. A soft breeze stirred, ruffling the thin hairs on your arms and brushing your robe against your skin, carrying scents from distant hills, the faint aroma of dew-kissed stones and desert flowers, blending into the hum until it felt like a living presence, gentle and intentional. You noticed how the cross's shadow stretched across the sand, elongated and wavering with the night's faint breeze, and realized that the silence itself had form, moving subtly in rhythm with the hum, a quiet geometry that spoke of patience, memory, and things unseen yet deeply known. The hum rose and fell like a tide, soft as the inhale and exhale of a deep, slow breath, and you felt yourself drawn into it, your heartbeat sensing imperceptibly with the vibration, your chest rising and falling as though breathing with the desert itself. You watched the stars shimmer faintly, reflections in distant pools of dew catching and releasing the desert's song, and understood that the melody carried across time through the night, through valleys and dunes, connecting every quiet corner of this vast, patient world. The cross glimmered once more, edges softening in the faint light, and you felt the hum settle around you like a blanket, a lullaby woven from stone, sand, wind, and wood, pressing gently against your ears, your chest, your mind, a quiet invitation to rest and remember. You lay back on the cool sand, finally, feeling the grains press softly into your palms and back, inhaling the desert's scent, the faint sweetness of night flowers, the mineral temps of stone, and let the hum carry you gently, like a wave lapping against a shoreline only you could hear. And as sleep tugged softly at your eyelids, you realized that some silences are alive, humming with life, memory, and light, and that the desert, the cross, and every small motion of night conspire quietly to remind those who listen that even absence has its own music. You awaken before the sun fully rises, feeling the chill of the early morning sand pressed beneath your hands and feet, the faint scent of tamarisk and stone carried on a breeze, so gentle it seems to barely exist, yet brushes your skin with quiet insistence. The cross atop the hill catches the first threads of light, a subtle shimmer that spreads slowly down its weathered wood, softening shadows, revealing textures unseen in moonlight, and you notice how even the smallest cracks glow faintly, as if the desert itself recognizes their endurance. You breathe in slowly, savoring the mixture of cool earth and faint warmth from stones that had held yesterday's sun, feeling the sensation ripple through your chest, a quiet pulse that connects you to every ridge, dune, and crevice of the valley stretching beneath the pale horizon. A faint bird song rises from the distant tamarisk, delicate and wavering, threading through the air like a ribbon of sound, and you realize how every tiny presence, rock, leaf, bird, sand participates in the morning's awakening, a symphony only the patient can hear. The lanterns from nights past seem to glow faintly still in memory, reflections captured in tiny pools of dew, and you feel their presence alongside the cross, a subtle echo of light moving through the valley as if marking the rhythm of unseen steps long forgotten. You step slowly across the riverbed, toes pressing into cool sand, feeling its faint resistance and the smooth texture of small stones beneath. The desert quiet yet alive, each grain a record of centuries, each contour a subtle story waiting for the light to reveal it fully. The air carries a faint sweetness now, a whisper of desert flowers blooming unseen, mingling with mineral scent and warmth of stone. And you notice how the cross stands neither imposing nor silent, but patient, illuminated gently by light that knows neither hurry nor expectation. Shadows retreat slowly from ridges and dunes, and you feel the desert's pulse in your chest, slow and deliberate, a rhythm older than villages, older than footsteps, carrying the memory of all nights, all lanterns, all whispers, and every quiet person who once paused to notice. A soft breeze carries with it distant aromas, the faint scent of sand warmed by first light, the mineral temps of stone, and the faint aroma of water beneath dry riverbeds, each subtle note folded into the morning as if the desert composes its own symphony with careful patience. You approach the cross, the wood warming faintly beneath your hands, the edges glowing softly with light that feels neither fire nor reflection. a warmth born of enduring presence, the kind that grows quietly when the world is still enough to receive it. You notice small stones near its base, polished by centuries of wind, their colors deepened in the morning glow, and for a moment the cross and the valley, the desert and the sky, feel alive with memory and attention, a silent choir where every grain participates in song. The sun rises fully now, spilling gold across the dunes, brushing the valley in gentle light, revealing hidden curves, folds, and textures in sand and stone. And you feel your chest expand with the calm insistence of a world that has always moved in patient rhythms beyond ordinary sight. You hear faint whispers in the air, not words exactly, but the soft resonance of memory, of wind passing over stone, of tamarisk leaves shifting, carrying centuries of attention, footsteps, and quiet devotion. And you feel that the cross has absorbed them all, reflecting them now in the soft light of morning. The lantern's memory flickers faintly in your mind, tiny echoes in distant reflections, reminding you of nights when light traveled alone. Wind bent slowly across the dunes, and the desert held its breath for moments of quiet understanding, moments that now unfold fully in morning's glow. You sit in the sand for a long while, feeling the warmth of sun-softened stone beneath your hands, inhaling the desert air, and sensing the subtle hum of life in every blade, every grain, every curve of the dunes, as though the valley itself has learned to breathe in rhythm with the cross. The first traveler emerges from distant dunes, stopping at the valley's edge, and you notice how the light catches the folds of their robe, their face shadowed yet open to the glow, as if they have come to witness not a spectacle, but a quiet revelation that requires no eyes but patient hearts. You rise and take a slow step toward the hilltop, feeling the sand yield beneath your feet, and notice how the cross now stands fully illuminated, not bright but steady, its presence a calm reminder that some things shine only when the world is still enough to recognize their endurance. A soft breeze stirs once more, carrying scents of stone, sand, and distant flora, and you feel the desert stretch, shift, and breathe, the cross standing tall amid the subtle music of wind, shadow, and light, all converging to create a quiet miracle that belongs to neither you nor anyone else, yet touches you completely. You lie back, finally, letting the sand cradle your body, feeling its coolness beneath and the first warmth of sun upon your cheeks, inhaling the mixture of mineral, flora, and desert air, and you understand that the cross has always shone, even when no one watched, its light carried in patience, memory, and quiet attention. And as your eyelids grow heavy, you carry that morning with you, the hum of the desert, the glow of the cross, the slow rhythm of light and sand, knowing that some presences endure, some lights shine quietly, and some truths exist beyond sight, whispering softly to anyone willing to pause and remember.